The rain poured down in heavy sheets, tapping against the car windows like impatient fingers. Officer Brad Turner tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his eyes flicking toward the rearview mirror. Another long night on patrol, another shift filled with routine stops, paperwork, and the occasional drunk driver. But tonight felt different. There was a tension in the air, something unspoken, something waiting. Then the radio crackled. "All units, be advised, we've got a report of a suspicious vehicle near Maple and 5th. Black SUV. Possible expired tags." Brad reached for the radio. "Unit 47 responding. I'm a block away." With a sigh, he flicked on his lights and made a sharp turn toward the location. His partner, Officer Greg Daniels, chuckled beside him. "Bet it's another college kid forgetting to renew their registration." Brad smirked but didn't respond. His eyes locked onto the SUV parked near the curb. Dark windows. No movement inside. He pulled up behind it and stepped out, adjusting his belt as he approached. His boots splashed against the wet pavement, the red and blue lights flashing against the dark exterior of the vehicle. Tap on the window. No response. Brad knocked harder. "License and registration." Slowly, the driver's side window rolled down, revealing a black woman in her mid-30s. Her expression was calm, almost too calm. She reached for her purse, moving with a deliberate slowness. "Step out of the vehicle," Brad ordered, his tone sharp. The woman sighed, clearly annoyed, but did as she was told. She was dressed in business casual attire, her coat neatly buttoned. There was no panic, no nervousness, just a quiet confidence that rubbed Brad the wrong way. "Put your hands where I can see them," he demanded. The woman raised an eyebrow. "For what?" "Expired tags," he shot back. "And I smell attitude." His partner snickered. She let out a short breath, shaking her head. "Look, officer. I didn't ask for a debate. Turn around." Her jaw tightened, but she complied. The moment Brad reached for his cuffs, she stiffened. "You don't want to do this," she warned. Brad scoffed. "Oh, I think I do." The cold steel clicked around her wrists. She stood there, unmoving, her posture straight. No pleading, no arguing. Just that same unsettling calm. He nudged her forward. "We'll let the court figure this out." 7 minutes later, as they sat in the precinct, waiting for the paperwork to process, the captain stormed in. His face was red, his voice tight with restrained anger. "Turner, Daniels, uncuff her. Right now." Brad frowned. "Sir, Now." Greg hurried to obey, fumbling with the key. As soon as the cuffs were off, the woman rubbed her wrists, taking her time. Then she reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a badge. Federal badge. The room fell silent. Brad felt the blood drain from his face. "You just arrested a federal agent," the captain hissed. The woman's gaze locked onto Brad's, steady and unwavering. "And I hope you're ready for the consequences." Brad swallowed hard. This was bad. Really bad. Brad's hands curled into fists at his sides, but he forced himself to keep a neutral expression. His pulse pounded in his ears, drowning out the steady hum of chatter in the precinct. Greg took a small step back, shifting uncomfortably as if he could somehow disappear from the situation. The woman, Agent Michelle Carter, didn't break eye contact. She let the silence sit heavy in the air, waiting. Then, slowly, she placed her badge on the table in front of them, tapping it lightly with her fingers. "I gave you multiple chances," she said, her voice even. "I told you that you didn't want to do this. But you didn't listen." Brad clenched his jaw. His mind raced, searching for a way to spin this, to explain why a simple traffic stop had turned into something much worse. He'd been in law enforcement long enough to know when he was in trouble. And this was a disaster. The captain pinched the bridge of his nose. "Agent Carter, I sincerely apologize for this mess." He shot Brad a look that could burn through steel. "I assure you this is not how we conduct business here." Michelle exhaled through her nose, shaking her head slightly. Funny. Because this feels like business as usual to me. The words stung, but Brad refused to flinch. His gut twisted as he realized just how bad this looked. A white cop arresting a black federal agent over expired tags. Except she hadn't even had expired tags. He hadn't checked. He hadn't given her a chance to explain. He just assumed. Greg cleared his throat awkwardly. We can fix this. Right. He looked between Michelle and the captain, his nervous energy making the air feel even heavier. Michelle tilted her head slightly, considering him. That depends. The captain turned to Brad. Take a walk. Now. Brad hesitated, his pride prickling, but he knew better than to argue. He gave Michelle one last glance before turning sharply on his heel and walking out of the room. He didn't go far, just to the hallway where he leaned against the wall, dragging a hand down his face. This couldn't be happening. It wasn't just about the arrest. It was about what it meant, what it revealed. He had no idea who Michelle Carter really was or why she had been in that car, sitting there so calmly, as if she had been waiting for something. Something didn't add up. Greg followed him out a moment later, rubbing the back of his neck. Dude, what the hell just happened? Brad let out a slow breath. I don't know. Think she's gonna press charges. Brad didn't answer. He didn't need to. Michelle Carter had power. Real power. And she knew it. Inside the captain's office, voices rose and fell, but he couldn't make out the words. His mind replayed every detail of the encounter, every moment where he could have made a different choice. Why had he been so quick to escalate? Why hadn't he just let her explain? Because she hadn't been scared. That's what had gotten under his skin. Most people, when confronted by cops, had a look in their eyes. Fear, uncertainty, maybe even anger. But Michelle Carter. She had looked at him like she was in control the whole time. And she had been. Greg shifted beside him. This is bad, man. Brad shot him a look. Yeah, I got that. No, I mean she's not just some agent. I heard the captain say her name. Michelle Carter. I think I've heard it before. Greg frowned, thinking. Yeah, I remember now. She was involved in some big undercover sting last year. FBI level. Maybe even higher. Brad stared at him. You're telling me we just arrested someone that high up over nothing? Greg let out a dry laugh. I don't think it was nothing. I think we just walked into something way bigger than we realize. Brad's stomach turned. This wasn't just about him making a bad call. This was about something else entirely. The door to the office swung open, and the captain stepped out. His expression was tight, controlled. Go home. Both of you. Sir. I said go home. Brad glanced back at the office. Michelle Carter was still inside, standing by the window, her back to them. She wasn't done with him. And something told him that whatever was coming next was going to be worse than just an apology. Brad drove home in silence, his fingers tapping against the steering wheel, his mind racing. The streetlights blurred past, their glow stretching across the rain-slicked pavement. The whole night felt unreal. He had made arrests before, some routine, some tense, but nothing like this. Nothing that left a knot in his stomach long after it was over. Greg had tried to talk on the way to their cars, throwing out theories, trying to find some angle that would make this feel less like a disaster. But Brad wasn't in the mood to hear it. He wasn't stupid. He knew exactly what had happened back there. He had arrested a woman without cause, based on a gut feeling that had been way off. And now, she had the power to end his career with a single report. But that wasn't what bothered him the most. It was the way she had looked at him. Not angry. Not scared. Just knowing. Like she had expected all of it. He pulled into his driveway, shutting off the engine. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, tapping softly against the windshield. He sat there for a moment, staring at the dashboard, willing his mind to stop replaying the moment she pulled out her badge. Who was she, really? The next morning, Brad walked into the station, his chest tight. He half expected to find his locker cleaned out, a letter on his desk telling him to pack up and leave. But when he got to his desk, everything was still there. Business as usual. Greg was already waiting for him, his face tense. "She's still here." Brad frowned. "What?" Greg nodded toward the captain's office. The blinds were half closed, but through the gaps, Brad could see Michelle Carter sitting inside. She wasn't in handcuffs this time. She wasn't even standing. She was sitting across from the captain, leaning back in her chair, completely at ease. "She's been here all morning," Greg muttered. "I heard she asked to see the department records. Not just for last night. For the past 6 months." Brad's stomach tightened. "Why?" Greg shrugged. "No idea. But it's bad, man." Brad sat down, but he couldn't focus. His eyes kept drifting toward the office, toward the woman who now held his fate in her hands. If she wanted to, she could ruin him. But if that was her goal, why was she still here? A few minutes later, the office door opened, and the captain stepped out, his expression unreadable. Michelle followed, adjusting her coat. For the first time, she glanced in Brad's direction. It wasn't a glare. It wasn't even disappointment. It was a challenge. Then she turned and walked out of the precinct, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than anything she had said. Brad exhaled slowly, rubbing his face. "What the hell is going on?" he muttered. That night, Brad found himself parked outside an old diner on the edge of town, gripping a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. He hadn't meant to end up here, but his mind had been too restless to go home. And apparently, he wasn't the only one. Through the foggy window of the diner, he spotted Michelle Carter sitting in a corner booth, flipping through a file. Loan. For a split second, he considered driving away. But instead, he got out of the car. The bell above the door jingled as he stepped inside, and Michelle didn't even look up. Brad hesitated, then walked over. "Agent Carter," she sighed, closing the file. "Officer Turner." Beat of silence. Brad nodded toward the empty seat across from her. "Mind if I sit?" She studied him for a moment, then gestured for him to go ahead. Brad slid into the booth, resting his hands on the table. "You've been looking through our records." "Yes," she said simply. "Why?" She leaned back slightly. "You arrested me last night because something about me made you suspicious." Brad stiffened but said nothing. "Well," she continued, "I'm doing the same thing. Something about this precinct makes me suspicious." His brows furrowed. "What are you talking about?" Michelle tapped the file with her fingertips. "I was parked on that street last night for a reason. I was waiting for someone." Brad's pulse kicked up. "Who?" Her lips pressed into a thin line. "Someone who didn't show up." Brad frowned. "And that has to do with us." Michelle studied him for a long moment. "What do you really know about the people you work with?" Brad felt a flicker of irritation. "I know enough." "Do you?" She tilted her head slightly. "Because your department has a pattern. One that doesn't look good." Brad's jaw tightened. "What pattern?" Michelle slid the file across the table. He hesitated before opening it. Inside were reports, incident logs, complaints, internal memos. Some of the names he recognized. Others he didn't. But one thing stood out. A list of arrests. All of them had a common thread. Brad's stomach twisted. Michelle watched him carefully. "Still think you know enough?" Brad didn't respond. Because for the first time he wasn't sure. Brad's hands tightened around the file as he flipped through the pages again. His pulse thudding in his ears. The names, the dates, the complaints. There was no way to ignore the pattern staring back at him. He recognized some of the officers listed, men he worked alongside every day. There were excessive force allegations, questionable traffic stops, people booked and released with no clear charges. He swallowed hard. "Where did you get this?" Michelle leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. "I told you, I've been watching this department. Last night wasn't about me. It was about the fact that I was there at the wrong time in the wrong place. And you reacted exactly the way I expected. Brad looked up sharply. What's that supposed to mean? She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she studied him, as if she was trying to figure out just how much he was willing to hear. Finally, she sighed. How long have you been a cop, Turner? Brad hesitated. 9 years. 9 years. Michelle nodded slowly. And in all that time, you never noticed anything off? Brad opened his mouth to argue, but the words didn't come. Because now, sitting here, staring at the evidence in front of him, he wasn't sure what he had or hadn't noticed. Michelle took the file back, flipping to a page near the end. This is the part that concerns me the most. She tapped the paper. Brad's stomach dropped as he read the names. There were civilians, people from the community. But on another list there were officers. Some still active, some transferred, and some missing. Michelle's voice was quiet but firm. One of your officers was supposed to meet me last night. Brad's head snapped up. Who? Her expression darkened. Officer Reggie Collins. Brad's breath caught. Collins transferred out 2 months ago. That's what your department says. Michelle slid another paper in front of him. A missing persons report, filed just 3 weeks earlier. His family hasn't seen or heard from him since. Brad's fingers twitched. That doesn't make sense. He told everyone he got an offer in another city. Did he? Michelle's voice was edged with something sharp. Or did someone make him disappear? Brad shook his head. No, that's not. Collins wouldn't have just vanished. Michelle exhaled. Collins reached out to the feds before he went missing. He wanted protection. He was ready to talk about what was happening inside this department. Brad felt his heart hammering against his ribs. Talk about what? Michelle's gaze didn't waver. Corruption, illegal arrest, payoffs, a pause, and something bigger. Brad's throat went dry. Michelle leaned in, lowering her voice. I think he found out something he wasn't supposed to. And I think your department covered it up. Brad's mind raced. This was insane. He had worked with Collins. He wasn't the kind of guy to get involved in something like this. But if what Michelle was saying was true, then someone in his own department had a reason to silence him. His stomach churned. You think he's dead? Michelle's expression gave nothing away. I think someone wanted him gone. Brad pressed his hands against the table, trying to steady himself. If that's true, why are you telling me? Because, Michelle said, you still have a choice. Brad's head spun. Everything he thought he knew about his department, his co-workers, his own instincts, it was all unraveling in front of him. Before he could respond, the diner door swung open, and Brad felt a chill crawl up his spine. 2 uniformed officers stepped inside. Not just any officers. Guys from his precinct. They spotted him immediately. Their gazes flickered between him and Michelle, their expressions unreadable. Brad didn't move. Michelle's voice was calm but firm. Stay still. One of the officers, Officer Langley, gave a tight smile. Turner. Didn't expect to see you here. Brad forced himself to breathe. Just grabbing coffee. Langley's eyes slid to Michelle. Mind introducing us to your friend? Michelle slowly placed her hands on the table, keeping them visible. I think you already know who I am. Langley's jaw ticked. Yeah, we do. A heavy silence hung between them. Brad suddenly realized something. These guys weren't here by accident. Someone had sent them. And now, sitting in a booth with a federal agent, surrounded by files that could tear the department apart, Brad knew he was officially on the wrong side of something dangerous. Michelle's voice was steady. Did someone send you? Langley didn't answer. But his partner shifted slightly, his hand resting near his belt. Brad tensed. Michelle didn't flinch. You should walk away. Langley's expression hardened. I don't think we can do that. Brad's heart pounded. He had spent years working alongside these guys, trusting them. But now, sitting across from them, he could see it. The hesitation, the calculation. Michelle had been right. Something was very, very wrong. And now, Brad wasn't sure if he was going to make it out of this diner in one piece. The air in the diner was thick with tension. Brad's pulse pounded as he glanced between Langley and his partner. The way they stood, the way their hands hovered too close to their belts. It wasn't just a casual check-in. They were here with a purpose. Michelle remained still, her eyes locked on Langley's. "This is a bad idea," she said calmly. Langley gave a tight smile. "That's so." "Yeah," she replied. "Because if something happens to me here, it won't just disappear. And neither will Turner." Brad swallowed hard. He wasn't sure if she was bluffing or if she really had something set in motion, but either way she wasn't backing down. Langley exhaled sharply and ran a hand over his jaw. "You've been digging into things you shouldn't, Carter." His voice was low, measured. Michelle tilted her head slightly. "Funny. I was about to say the same to you." Langley's jaw tightened. Brad finally spoke. His voice a little unsteady. "What happened to Collins?" Langley didn't react at first. But then a slow, humorless smirk spread across his face. "You really don't want to ask that question, Turner." Brad felt his stomach drop. That wasn't a denial. Michelle's expression didn't change. "Who gave the order?" Langley's partner shifted slightly, glancing toward the door. A small but telling movement. He was nervous. Brad took a breath. "Look, we can fix this," he said, forcing his voice to stay even. "Nobody needs to do anything stupid." Langley let out a dry chuckle. "Buddy, we're way past stupid." Before Brad could respond, Michelle moved. Her hand shot out, knocking over her coffee cup. The hot liquid spilled across the table, forcing Langley and his partner to react instinctively. Flinching, moving back just an inch. It was all the space she needed. In one smooth motion, Michelle pulled a small badge holder from her pocket and flipped it open, raising it just enough for them to see. "I'm not alone," she said, her voice controlled but sharp. "And if you do something reckless, my people will be here before you even make it to your car." Langley's smirk faltered. His partner stiffened. Brad felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt all night. "Oh." For the first time, Langley looked unsure. He shifted his weight, glanced at his partner, then back at Michelle. "You're bluffing." Michelle didn't blink. "Try me." The silence stretched. Then slowly Langley let out a breath. "This isn't over." Michelle didn't move. "It never is." Langley gave Brad one last unreadable look, then jerked his chin toward the door. Without another word, he and his partner turned and walked out, leaving the diner in heavy silence. Brad exhaled shakily. "You had backup." Michelle shook her head. "No." Brad blinked. "So you were bluffing." She took a slow sip of water. "Did it work?" Brad let out a breathless laugh, rubbing a hand down his face. "I can't believe this." Michelle leaned forward. "Believe it. Those two weren't just here to intimidate us, Turner. They were here to make sure we stop looking." Brad swallowed. "And we're not stopping, are we?" Michelle's gaze was steady. "Not even close." Brad ran a hand through his hair. He had walked into this diner thinking his biggest problem was an unfair arrest. Now he was realizing he had been part of something much bigger, something dangerous. And the worst part, he still didn't know just how deep it went. Brad felt the weight of everything crashing down at once. His entire career, his entire understanding of the people he worked with, had just been flipped upside down. He had spent years believing in the badge, believing that his department stood for something. But now, sitting across from Michelle in this tiny diner, he realized he had been blind. Michelle placed the file back into her bag and glanced at him. "You still in?" Brad hesitated. He knew that if he stepped any further into this, there was no going back. His job, his reputation, maybe even his life, it was all on the line. But if he walked away now, he'd be no better than the people covering this up. He met Michelle's gaze. "Yeah," he said. "I'm in." Michelle nodded, as if she had expected that answer. Good. Then we need to move fast. Brad exhaled, his hands gripping the edge of the table. Where do we start? Before Michelle could respond, Brad's phone vibrated on the table. He glanced down. A blocked number. His heart pounded as he hesitated, then answered. Hello. A voice on the other end sent a chill down his spine. Turner, you need to drop this. Brad stiffened. Who is this? You already know, the voice said. You and your new friend need to walk away. Now. Brad's grip tightened. Or what? The line was silent for a moment. Then the voice spoke again, cold and certain. Or you'll end up like Collins. Brad's blood ran cold. The line went dead. Michelle watched him carefully. Who was it? Brad slowly lowered the phone. Someone who doesn't want us to keep digging. Michelle's jaw clenched. Then we're getting close. Brad ran a hand down his face, his mind racing. If Collins had really been killed for trying to expose the corruption, then whoever was behind this had no problem making people disappear. And now, Brad and Michelle were next on their list. We need proof, Michelle said. Something solid. Something they can't erase. Brad took a deep breath, forcing himself to think. Then it hit him. The security room. Michelle raised an eyebrow. At the precinct. Brad nodded. Every arrest, every interrogation, every piece of evidence. It's all recorded. If Collins was onto something, maybe he left a trail. If we can get into that system, we might find something that ties this all together. Michelle considered it, then nodded. It's risky. Brad let out a dry laugh. Yeah. No kidding. They both knew what this meant. Walking into the precinct now was like walking into a trap. But it was their only shot. 30 minutes later, Brad parked a block away from the station. The building was quiet, only a few cars outside. Night shift officers would be inside, but most of the higher-ups were gone. If they were lucky, they could get in and out without drawing too much attention. Michelle adjusted her jacket. You ready? Brad exhaled. Not even a little. They moved quickly, entering through the back entrance. The station felt different tonight. Heavier, like the walls themselves were watching them. Brad led the way down the hall, his heart pounding. They reached the security room and he pulled out his keycard. His hands were slick with sweat as he swiped it. The light turned green. They stepped inside. Michelle immediately went to the monitors, scanning through files. Brad stood by the door, listening for any sounds outside. Got it, Michelle whispered. Brad turned. What is it? She pulled up a video. It was grainy but clear enough. The footage showed Officer Collins sitting at a desk in an empty office. He looked nervous, checking over his shoulder. Then he pulled out a flash drive and plugged it into a computer. He typed something, then paused as if thinking. Finally, he removed the drive, tucked it into his pocket, and stood up. Then the door opened. Langley stepped inside. Brad felt his stomach tighten. On the video, Collins froze. There were no words exchanged. Just a long, tense stare. Then Langley reached for something at his waist. The video cut out. Brad felt like the air had been knocked out of him. Michelle's fingers flew over the keyboard. Come on, there has to be more. She pulled up another file. Security logs. The system had been wiped, except for one thing. An external device had been connected to a precinct computer that night. Collins' flash drive. Michelle's eyes met Brad's. Where would they keep it? Brad's mind raced. If they didn't destroy it, it would be in evidence storage. They didn't get a chance to move. A voice behind them sent an icy shock through Brad's veins. Step away from the computer. Slowly he turned. Langley stood in the doorway. He wasn't alone. 3 other officers stood behind him, blocking the exit. Langley tilted his head, a smirk tugging at his lips. You just couldn't leave it alone, could you? Brad's hands curled into fists. You killed him. Langley chuckled. Killed. That's a strong word. Michelle's voice was steady. Where's the flash drive? Langley shook his head. You think you're gonna walk out of here with that? He stepped closer, his smirk fading. You don't get it, do you? You're not the good guys here. You're just loose ends. Brad's pulse roared in his ears. He could see it now, the way Langley's fingers twitched, the way his men shifted slightly, ready for whatever came next. They weren't planning to let them walk out. Michelle gave Brad a look. Silent signal. Brad took a breath. Then everything happened at once. Michelle moved first, shoving the keyboard off the desk, sending it crashing to the floor. Langley flinched, and in that split second, Brad lunged. He slammed into Langley, knocking him back, but the other officers reacted fast. One grabbed Michelle, trying to restrain her, but she twisted, using their own momentum to break free. Brad struggled against Langley, grappling for control. You don't have to do this, he gritted out. Langley sneered. Yeah, I do. A loud click echoed in the room. Everyone froze. Michelle stood near the desk, holding a small recording device in her hand. A red light blinked. Langley's eyes darkened. What did you do? Michelle smiled. Everything you just said. It's not just between us anymore. Brad's heart pounded as realization dawned on Langley's face. Michelle pressed a button. And I'd say backup should be here. Right about now. A distant siren wailed through the night. Langley's smirk vanished. His men exchanged uneasy glances. The sound grew closer. Then the station doors burst open. More officers stormed in, uniformed, armed, and wearing the unmistakable jackets of federal agents. Langley's face drained of color. You set us up. Michelle tucked the recorder into her pocket. No. You set yourselves up. Brad exhaled shakily as the agents moved in, taking Langley and his men into custody. It was over. Or at least that's what he thought. As Michelle and Brad stepped outside, watching the arrests unfold, she handed him a small slip of paper. Brad frowned. What's this? She gave him a knowing look. The last location Officer Collins' phone pinged before he disappeared. Brad felt a chill crawl down his spine. It wasn't over. Not yet. Brad stared at the slip of paper in his hand, the weight of it pressing down on him. He should have felt relief. Langley and his men were in custody. The department's corruption was being exposed. But something inside him told him this wasn't over. Not yet. Michelle watched him carefully. You don't have to go. Brad let out a slow breath. Yeah, I do. She nodded, as if she already knew that would be his answer. Then let's go. The address led them to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. It was the kind of place no one would think twice about, a forgotten building covered in rust and dust. But as they pulled up, Brad felt his stomach tighten. If this was the last place Collins' phone had pinged, then whatever happened to him had happened here. They stepped out of the car, their footsteps echoing in the quiet night. Michelle scanned the area. This place feel off to you? Brad nodded. Yeah. They pushed through the heavy metal doors. The air inside was stale, thick with the scent of oil and something else, something metallic. The faint glow of moonlight filtered through broken windows, casting long shadows across the concrete floor. Then Brad saw it. In the center of the room, half covered in dust and grime, was a chair. Heavy duty, bolted to the ground. Nearby, a length of rope lay coiled on the floor. The sight of it sent a wave of nausea through him. Michelle crouched down, her fingers brushing against a small, dark stain on the ground. She didn't need to say it. They both knew what it was. Brad swallowed hard. They brought him here. Michelle stood, her jaw tightening. And they never meant for him to leave. Brad's fists clenched. He had spent years believing in the system, trusting that the people wearing the badge were there to do the right thing. But standing here, in this place where a good cop had been silenced, he realized how wrong he had been. Michelle moved toward an old desk in the corner, sifting through discarded papers and debris. Then she froze. Brad. He turned. She held up a small USB drive. Brad's pulse quickened. You think it's his? Michelle nodded. Only one way to find out. They drove in silence, their minds racing. Back at Michelle's apartment, she plugged the USB into her laptop. A single file popped up. Video. Michelle clicked play. Collins appeared on the screen, sitting in what looked like his own apartment. His face was tense, his eyes darting to the door every few seconds. "If you're watching this, something happened to me," he said, his voice steady but low. "And if something happened to me, it's because of what I found." Brad leaned in closer. Collins exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "I thought it was just rumors at first. But then I saw the transfers. Money moving through accounts that shouldn't exist. And Langley. He's at the center of it." Michelle's jaw tightened. Collins continued. "They're covering up more than just dirty money. There's a whole network. Judges, politicians. People way higher up than just the department." He hesitated. "And if they know I know, they won't let me walk away." The screen flickered. Collins glanced toward the door, his body going rigid. Then the video cut out. Brad let out a shaky breath. He knew they were coming for him. Michelle sat back, her expression unreadable. And he still tried to do the right thing. They both sat in silence for a long moment. Then Michelle spoke. "This isn't just about Langley anymore. It never was." Brad nodded slowly. "It goes higher." They knew what that meant. Langley might have been taken down, but the people pulling the strings, they were still out there. Michelle shut the laptop. "So what now?" Brad thought about it. About Collins. About the risk he took. About the choice he made. And then he thought about himself. He had spent years looking the other way, convincing himself that what he saw wasn't as bad as it seemed. That maybe, just maybe, the system would fix itself. He knew better now. Brad looked at Michelle, a fire in his eyes that hadn't been there before. "We keep going." A small smile tugged at the corner of her lips. "Thought you'd say that." The night stretched on, but something had changed. They weren't just two people stumbling into something bigger than them anymore. They were two people making a choice. A choice to stand up. Choice to fight back. A choice to make sure that what happened to Collins wouldn't happen to anyone else. The road ahead was long, dangerous, uncertain. But for the first time in a long time, Brad knew exactly where he stood.